Off with Waleed, who is here from San Francisco. You may have read about him, but Waleed does some very cool things to help people. He's created little tiny robots that could go into disaster areas to search for people and help with recovery there. Then we'll be going to Sarah Kaufman, who does some great work in New York City. She's one of 10 people who have a shared electric scooter from Bird, because they're not in New York City the way they are in Denver. They've been more controlled like here, but she has one. Ann Daigle is out of New Orleans, and she just gave away her car and travels around in other ways. She gave it to National Public Radio, so she's living that community life. And finally, Joshua David, also living the community developed cities life, has been riding the same bike since 7th grade until just recently when he died. So a little tidbit about all of our panelists. We're going to start with 5 minutes from each of them, opening statements, and then we'll go to questions. I've been asked to read this. If you've been to other sessions, you've heard it. But in this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You can also raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Where are our producers? There you go. There's several here in the room, one back there, so they're ready for you. You must write legibly. If you're a student or attending remotely, please note this in your question and make your questions brief and to the point. Let's get started. Waleed Qudoos.
Hi, my name's Waleed. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first CWA, but already it's been such a wonderful experience. I'm a principal engineer at Uber. I work on emerging technologies and asking the questions about how these emerging technologies can help with mobility and transportation. And I thought about the question for a few minutes, and I thought, does it have to be dangerous by design? Why can't it be safe by design? Why can't it be efficient by design? And as I thought about it, I realized that there are some very, very good reasons from a technology perspective to be optimistic about the future of safety and efficiency of our transport systems, regardless of the vehicle that is used. And to summarize them, I'll say them quickly. It's data, artificial intelligence, connections, the vehicles themselves, and things like conversational interfaces that I think provide an opportunity or provide a toolkit that give us a lot of options, right? And I'm not always a techno-optimist. I think the great thing about this set of technologies is that we're starting to see elements of them now. We don't have to wait. It's not like Star Trek or anything like that. We're starting to see those elements happen now and affect city design now. And that's why I'm really excited and optimistic about our ability to make cities safer. So to go through them and just spend a few moments on each of these, data. We now understand the dynamics of a city much better than we have before. Whether it's through public transit apps or apps like Uber or just the ticketing systems that now are actually taking that data and helping us to understand what the needs across the city are, that's opening up a lot of opportunities. And like, I work for Uber, but I'm not shilling for them or anything like that. But to give you two examples of what they've done things like make data sets available at a website called Uber Movement that shows aggregated results for a city, how long it takes to get from one area to another, how many people want to go from one part of a city to another part of the city at a given time. And this is a boon for city designers and planners. Another one is we've analyzed braking patterns and helped to identify where in the city are the dangerous intersections. And that opens up a lot of possibilities. Artificial intelligence is something that I think many of you are hearing about, and there are many other sessions about here. But what artificial intelligence allows us to do is take that data and actually extract insights and optimize things in a way that no human would be able to do on their own. And what's really starting to be exciting with AI is hybrid solutions where urban designers and AI solutions kind of work on the problem together, work out how to define the criteria. And so AI is like opening up opportunities to push the situation forward. Historically, the third thing that I think is going to help us get further is the vehicles themselves are getting safer. And it's incredible to me just the level of technology that we're seeing in the vehicle sides. Historically, we've designed cities for safety, and the vehicles haven't been part of the equation, but that really opens up some possibilities. So some examples are forward collision warning systems and automatic emergency braking. We now have the statistics on those, and they both reduce the number of accidents and the severity of accidents. And in one IIH study, they said that if all vehicles had forward collision warning systems, which many vehicles already do, we'd reduce about 300,000 accidents per year. So it shows you what's possible. And just again, to show you how current the technology is, just 2 weeks ago, legislation was introduced into Congress to make passive alcohol interlock ignition switches mandatory on all vehicles, right? And that matters because 29% of fatalities for vehicles are caused by drunk driving. Like that's not a small number of people. That's tens of thousands of people. And so it's incredibly powerful to do that. The other thing is we're starting to see the benefits of cars being part of this communicative network. So you'll hear phrases in industry like vehicle to infrastructure and vehicle to vehicle. And let me just talk about one example of each of those. What if I was to tell you that at some future point, your car would talk to the traffic light, tell you how long you had to wait, and then would tell you the optimum speed to travel so that you would get a sequence of green lights? And you would say that's crazy, right? But it's already available. You can buy I'll mention the brand, but again, not shilling for them. You can buy an Audi today for $80,000 that has that capability. And it's this crazy thing called GLOSA, Green Light Optimized Speed Assistance, right? So one of my favorite Gibson quotes is the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think we see that. The other one is vehicle to vehicles. An average person might take half a second to brake, but if you have one vehicle talking to another, it's milliseconds. And half a second at 50 miles an hour is 70 feet. You can save lives with that 70 feet. And then finally, I think the last element is conversational elements, conversation, right? And we've all started to experiment this with a little bit in our cars, right? Distracted driving is 9% of fatalities, right? And I have to tell you, like, I still love my vehicle. I'm an avid vehicle lover, right? Yes, and so I wasn't sure if this was the right audience to share that with you all. But one of the nice things with my vehicle is that it has that conversational interfaces. And I have to admit, because I can just talk to it and say, send a text to my wife that I'm coming home, I haven't been tempted since earning that relatively new vehicle to text and drive, right? And it's a Golf. It's like not a particularly high-end vehicle. These modern vehicles have these safety capabilities now. So I think there's reasons for optimism. And I think, you know, combined with urban planning and what we can do there, there's reasons to think that we can actually make cities safer. Thanks.
Okay.
Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Kaufman. I have a research center at NYU, New York University. We are the Rudin Center for Transportation, where we focus on timely issues in transportation. I also teach a class on smart cities, so a lot of my work overlaps with yours, but from the academic perspective, which is slightly different. And I'm sorry for booing you, but I think that one thing we can all in this room agree on is that if we want a planet in 20 years, we're going to have to change the way, we're going to have to change the relationships that Americans have to their cars. In Orange County, California, cars outnumber people. Clearly, it's not a sustainable way of life. And so we need to really think about how we're going to get around in the future, whether it's around suburbs or cities or rural areas, and what that's going to look like. Traditionally, streets and highways have been planned for maximum throughput, maximum efficiency, but now transportation planning and thoughts about transportation are moving more towards the experience. What is it like when you're in the vehicle? How interesting is it? How efficient is it? Like, can you text your wife using just your voice? So that also needs to be carried over into the public sector, the public transit form of travel, which has been maximizing the number of people that can fit on a bus or a train at any given time is starting to be converted into how can we make it more interesting. Even in places like London, they've started playing classical music in some stations as an experiment, and they've seen crime rates drop in those stations. A lot of that is because people are calmer and more and just happier in the stations, or perhaps they feel like somebody's watching them because there's music playing. Either way, the focus is now on the experience rather than maximizing the throughput. And when we talk about vehicles, they are just part of the landscape, and more American cities need to be looking at how many options can we provide. In cities abroad, there are dozens of options to get around the cities. And in New York, there are currently 28 modes of travel, and only one of them is the private car. We have taxis, Ubers, we have bikes, eventually we'll have scooters. There are so many modes, and there are a lot of opportunities to expand the modes in every city to get people to experience transportation in a different way. I do have a bird scooter, and I find it to be a joyful experience riding it around. It's a lot more fun than riding the bus, for certain. And I think that if people can find a way to get around with particularly shared modes, such as shared rides or shared neighborhood vehicles, they will be happier eventually, and we will have a more sustainable future. The question that comes to mind when we talk about how great services like Uber are from the city's perspectives, how can we serve every user? Because private tech companies are 85% run by white males, we literally, the executive level of tech companies is 85% white male. Are we actually meeting the needs of every user by putting these companies at the helm of how we get around cities? I think most people would argue no. And in particular, when we look at people with disabilities, people who are older and can't use some of the modes, or people who aren't physically able to get on a bike or a scooter or something else, we need to plan for every type of user in cities and not let the private sector lead the way. And we have to shape our cities holistically to provide a variety of options for every type of user, every type of trip. So thank you.
Oh, really good. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's fun talking about, can you hear me? It's fun talking about the vehicles themselves, and I have to be honest. My very, very favorite thing to do is get in my dad's 1962 red Porsche and drive with all the windows down fast as I can on country roads I should not be speeding on. And my sister actually put together an MG when she was in college. So,
wow.
Obviously, our infrastructure is not keeping up with the technology of the vehicles themselves or the modes of transportation. I would like to add that not only do I want a safe and efficient road system or transportation system, I want it to be extremely convenient and beautiful. I want the roads to be beautiful. The incidence of pedestrian accidents is at its highest level in 15 years. And incrementally, it's gone up, I think it's 17% a year the past 3 years alone. And of course, the reason is because more people are walking, riding bikes, and obviously, people are not driving any better. Speed kills. You are very fortunate to have a wonderful civil engineer, Peter Swift from Longmont, Colorado, did one of the first studies on the incidence of pedestrian deaths based on speed limit. And any car going over 25 miles an hour is going to, the incidence of death increases exponentially. So the first thing that you can do is slow your cars down. You know, that's just part of it. 25 miles an hour. I think Paris and Barcelona, a number of cities in Europe now have the maximum you can drive anywhere in the city is 25 miles an hour because they recognize that is an important speed. So it's all about livability, and when we design our streets, which is what I'm very much involved in, we want to design streets for everybody, all modes of transportation, but primarily giving access to the pedestrian first. The only reason I don't like Amsterdam is because the bikes run you over. So pedestrians should come first. But think about it. If we did that, the independence that we give to our children and our elders, because that's the two groups of people that really are not able to access the community the way they should be able to. The other thing is the cost. When you think about the money that is spent on our gold-plated highways, it's amazing. And yet, for instance, in Dallas-Fort Worth area, they have these incredible, beautiful clover leaves and everything, and yet they have the highest incidence of children in poverty in the whole country. So where are the priorities? That money is there. Instead of the money coming down from the federal government designated for transportation, it should be, they should offer the city, do you want this money for, here's the money, you can spend it any way you want. But you have to spend it on some sort of public infrastructure. What would they do with it? Would they improve their schools? Would they build more parks? Think of all the alternatives, things that you could have if you didn't have that gold-plated highway. For instance, the cost and I have to tell you, if you go online and look for what it costs to build these things, it's all over the map. And I had always used the term that it was $60 a square foot. And that was years ago. I looked it up, and I think it's something like $127 a square foot now, so it's doubled since I last did that. But a square foot, think about what you could do with that money. Of course, we want the multi-modes, and I believe very strongly in transit, that the only way that I can do without my car is, number one, to walk. Which keeps me physically fit and much healthier than, for instance, my mother, who didn't walk as much because we grew up in a suburban area, and I live in an area where I can literally walk within a quarter of a mile. I have a clinic, I have 4 grocery stores, I have a dog vet and a cat vet, I have any kind of restaurant you can possibly imagine, plus shopping, wonderful shopping. I have a shoe store, I have great women's clothes. There's just so much opportunity when you don't fill your space with cars parked, both parked in parking lots and on that really wide road. I read too that it was, just to give you an idea, that if you say $150 million a mile for a subway, which is the most expensive thing to build, $100 million a mile for light rail, trolleys are less than that, and I think it's like $13.7 million a mile. And I know it can be built for less. There are organizations that are saying that one thing we need to look at is the requirements that we have for both federal and local to get these things approved. But anyway, I advocate for a network of streets, because the last thing I'm going to say is, in order to get good streets, you have to think beyond any single street. It's the network that counts. Okay.
Thanks. My name's Joshua David. I'm one of the 2 co-founders of the High Line in New York City. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm not actually going to talk all that much about the High Line today, but I'll talk a little bit about how the High Line led me into life as a citizens advocate for safer streets that are more equitably designed for different user types and for safety in general, safety in a more livable urban condition. back in the High Line itself is a reminder of a time that not that long ago when we were not dependent on automobiles for every form of mobility. It was part of a massive rail infrastructure project that serviced New York City and brought freight of foods and industrial products into New York City by train and deposited them in warehouses all along the West Side, allowing them to be then distributed by much smaller vehicles in New York City. It was basically, it went out of service with the rise of the interstate highway system, where trucks began to take over a large part of freight movement in the United States. And so if we look at New York City streets, we are working on streets that for many years were not dominated by the automobile. The domination of the automobile of New York City streets is a fairly recent occurrence historically, and there was much more time when it was not the dominating presence on New York Street than the time that it has been. As I began to advocate for the High Line, I ended up meeting a bunch of different people who I hadn't met before. And when I went to meetings with them, I would find that I was the only person who hadn't arrived on a bicycle. And I thought, well, there's a little peer pressure going on here. I better dig this famed 7th grade bicycle out of my basement and dust it off and start doing what everybody else is doing. And that little bit of peer pressure really changed the way that I look at being a New Yorker and mobility and urban mobility. We are in New Yorkers, we're shoved to the side of the streets. The sidewalks, many of which have been narrowed to make automobiles move more smoothly, press us up against the side of the building. We never get to really occupy what is the biggest piece of public space that we have in New York City, which is our streets. And so when you're on a bike, there is this, in New York City, there's this incredible feeling of liberation and freedom, even though it's sometimes very scary, because you get to occupy the prime public space of New York City, which is the street. And it completely changes the way that you experience the urban environment. And it was something that was even heightened at a very sad moment in my time in New York City, which was right after 9/11, where below 14th Street, all traffic was shut for, I can't remember how long, a number of days, a week. And so there was no vehicular movement except for emergency vehicles below 14th Street, but you could ride your bike freely. And I would get up every morning and do these amazing bike rides through south of 14th Street at a very sad moment in the city's history, but also being really amazed and inspired by what it meant to move around this city without any cars. I became a member and ultimately a member of an advisory council of the leading advocacy group in New York City for forms of transportation that are not private automobiles, called Transportation Alternatives, focusing primarily, until very recently, on transit, pedestrians, and cyclists. A lot of cycling was a dominant force in the organization for many years. Lately, the amazing opportunity of the scooter and battery-charged electric-assisted vehicles has come into the organization, causing, I think, some concern among some purists who think any kind of motorized anything is bad, but I think by more people who recognize the extraordinary opportunity that these forms of mobility offer us in the urban condition. I think the other opportunity that really excites me in New York City and in cities is for you. You were negative about buses. I'm pro buses. And I think people are negative about buses because buses are, for the most part, run badly. And a well-run bus is actually a really great thing. You don't have to go down to the subway. You don't have to go underground. You get to rise, again, in a privileged position up high on the street, looking at the cityscape around you. It's just that you can, in most bus lines in New York, you can walk faster than taking the bus. But following the work of a really visionary mayor in Bogota, Colombia, Enrique Peñalosa, who put in a bus rapid transit system in Bogota, rather than investing in roads, he made a calculated decision that with a certain amount of money, why prioritize the owner of expensive private vehicles over the poor people who can't afford expensive private vehicles. He put all of his eggs in the bus rapid transit basket, which essentially treats buses a little bit more like subways. You don't pay as you get on. Everybody pays at the curb. You can get on and off quickly. They design station-like environments that would allow for quick and easy boarding and dismounting, and made special lanes so the buses could travel faster without traffic interfering with them. They've done this a little bit in New York now. My local bus, the 23rd Street bus, they've put in curbside payment. They've painted a lane. They haven't made it a segregated lane, which is ultimately what would make it really run well. But already it's transformed that experience, and I think it's a real example of what buses can do for transportation in the urban condition. And I think the reflexive desire of officials to want to go towards subway expansion or light rail, both of which I love and support very highly, they're far, far, far more expensive than bus rapid transit. And bus rapid transit is really the low-hanging fruit of expansion of a transit system. And so I'm inspired to see it getting a little bit of a hold in New York City, and I hope it'll have much more. The other exciting thing that we have in New York City is we've just had a state and city law, it came through the state, passing congestion pricing. So now when cars enter Manhattan below 60th Street, they will be charged. The exact mechanisms of how that's going to work still need to be worked out. There's going to be a lot of political movement of lots of different constituencies are going to try and get themselves exempted from it. So you hope that in the end it actually has enough teeth to produce the funding stream that it's supposed to produce for public transit, which would be an amazing thing. So these are reasons for optimism. I think the same way that congestion pricing aims to lower the number of private vehicles on city streets, we, as has been said before, for the future of this planet, we need to lessen the number of private vehicles with a single occupant in them across the transportation system, not just in city streets, but on highways as well. And I'm less confident and more daunted about this, particularly when I think of we've had gasoline prices at historic lows in recent years. And yet any momentum to place any kind of carbon-based tax on that gasoline goes nowhere. You've seen what it meant in Paris when a very, very small gasoline tax was attempted to add there, the amount of revolt that occurred with that. So I think we do face some real challenges of getting people to change the way that they move and change their dependence on being a single driver in a car all by themselves. But that said, I think there are a lot of amazing innovations that are happening right now. And just to go back to one thing that you said about parking spaces, just in equity, in New York City in particular, the idea that you get this chunk of land on New York City streets that is the most expensive city among them in the world, and you as a driver of a car get to park for free on, you park your $20,000 to $70,000 piece of private property on a piece of land that is incredibly valuable, is just bonkers. And I think it's one of the equity issues that comes up throughout this discussion of how do you make this system economically just?
Great, that's a good start. We got a lot of good themes. I'm getting some questions. Good. I'm hoping to encourage you to raise your hand or go on the app and send me a few more questions. I'm going to kick it off with one. I hear several themes: the dominance of cars, the need for a network of streets, the new technology, and that hopefully will help pedestrian safety and other modes, and then some of the congestion pricing and tax issues. But the future, we're looking at all of these things. We're looking at electric vehicles. We're looking at mobility as a service, autonomous vehicles. All of those things could be great, and the technologies you mentioned could be great, or I guess they talk about it as a heaven and hell scenario. How do we make sure that moving forward with these new technologies and ideas that we're not just creating more vehicle miles traveled, more congestion, more greenhouse gases? what can local, state governments do, and federal, whatever, to move us towards fewer single occupancy vehicles.
Do you want to
go? In order to get people to travel more efficiently, we need to optimize our public transit systems, which in many cities in this country are not optimized. We need to make the bus more appealing and more efficient. I heard from many people at this conference yesterday how distraught they were about the absence of light rail that was supposed to come. So clearly that's a pain point. And what I would encourage is activism, similar to what Joshua was talking about, that he's doing in New York, which is fantastic. But that one way to get people around cities and between cities more rapidly is mass transit. The other thing we need to do with autonomous vehicles, since you mentioned them, are ensure that there is an equitable data sharing mechanism between cities and these car manufacturers and the car operators. So if a company like Uber or Lyft or Via has a fleet of vehicles, or Easy Mile, which is based in Denver, has a fleet of vehicles roaming city streets, they are collecting just terabytes of data every day. And the cities in which they are operating need to wise up on technology and learn to gather that data, learn to demand it, gather it, and analyze it so that the city can optimize public transit, figure out where people are going, and actually get people there more efficiently. The end game is not more ride sharing. The end game is more efficient shared trips and not more personal vehicles. So that's what I would say.
Okay.
So I guess I have a few thoughts on that. The first is that I think there is an acknowledgement of the fact that the average vehicle sits idle 96% of the time, like roughly speaking, right? So it sits doing nothing there, right? We can, and one approach is to discourage the ownership of vehicle, but there has to be a pragmatism about where we live, the cultural norms that exist, right? So we do, if we can learn to use that resource more effectively, and ride sharing is one but not the only mechanism to do that, we should consider it. The other thing is I think we need to make the experiences more seamless and allow people to have hybrids of solutions. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but here in Denver, Uber launched transit in the app. So you open the app and it gives you like Uber options, and it also gives you transit options. And they've cooperated together to make it seamless. So eventually what could happen is, and we have to acknowledge there's also a last mile problem that is the first and last mile is the hardest part of like replacing this. And that's where cooperation, whether it's scooters or e-bikes to get to a mass transit point, or ride shares or those types of things, if we can make it seamless so that, you know, the Uber is there at the right time or whatever it is, you get to the station, you get right on the bus, train, subway, whatever it is, and at the other end someone else is waiting there instead of you having to wait, and we can address the last mile problem. Where I'm really interested in, and where I think things are going, is hybrids. But hybrids are hard to use. Like, we don't even have algorithms now that allow us to do some of those things. And so that's something that I'm really excited about, is making it easier for people to use public transport and transit when it makes sense to do so.
I think there's also the kind of change that needs to come about has two very important components of it. One is public leadership from our elected officials, but our public leaders actually can't really lead in this zone without a really strong advocacy base behind them. And I think I saw this very clearly in the Bloomberg administration in New York City, where we had a visionary transportation commissioner named Jeanette Sadik Khan, who was bringing forth long wished for changes to the way that streets were designed, with bike lanes, with pedestrian safety facilities, with public plazas that had one effect of lessening the amount of space that was reserved exclusively for private automobiles. And Mayor Bloomberg was very much behind it. She was very bold in taking it forward, but it really helped that there was a strong advocates movement behind them to back them up publicly, because there's such a knee-jerk reaction in the general public about, it's a little bit like health insurance. No, everybody wants something to be better, but they don't want what they've got to be taken away from them. And I think with some of these transportation issues, they want people want a better transportation future, but don't take away my car. Or don't make it harder for me to drive a car. And so I think a really robust citizens activism network that can support elected officials in making the bold policy choices that they're going to need to make is really important.
Great.
The only thing I'd like to add is that transportation begins and ends with walking, and those sidewalks have to be there. You have to have the pedestrian infrastructure in place, and most cities don't. I was surprised Boulder has pretty good sidewalks.
Yeah. Great. I would just say that I heard Jeanette Sadiq Khan recently, and if you're interested in this topic, you might pick up her book called Street Fight. It was about the people that opposed her and the people that supported her, and the fact that Michael Bloomberg supported her. It's a fascinating story, transforming New York. We have several questions. One was, can you clarify how funding for transportation infrastructure has changed, and how it may need to change in order to achieve some of the goals that you're talking about?
Well, I'm going to, I take the very unpopular position of thinking that gasoline needs to be taxed more, especially when it's very low price right now. And we saw something really in the last 10 years really terrible happen in New Jersey, where the governor of New Jersey did everything within his power not to add a portion of a penny to the state's gas tax. At the same time, killing a huge federal funding package that would allow citizens from New Jersey to commute into New York by train more easily by building a much-needed third rail tunnel into Manhattan. So you see, and he took the public funding that was designated for that rail tunnel and basically used it to fill potholes, which...
Don't forget he built a mall with it.
So I think, just the way that we approach the real costs of car driving is something that we need to figure out. When you drive your car, there are a lot of subsidies that are supporting the driving of that car. And one of the ways to address it is through what is essentially a carbon tax. I've just been reading about how totally impossible carbon-based taxes are politically, and the movement within the climate change mitigation community to move away from talking about carbon taxes to other kinds of solutions because it's so toxic. But I think you need to, it's still one of the things.
I would like to say one thing that right now, transportation funding, local transportation funding, comes down from the federal government. The majority of it comes down through the state. Most projects sit in that mill for 10 and 15 years. By the time they get to the city, a lot of times the priorities have changed, but you've already done the design work, and you can't spend more money to do it the right way. So I think there needs to be a local source of funding so that more cities can be self-sufficient. And I don't know what that is. Maybe, you tax yourself, a property tax.
We just had one on the ballot that didn't pass.
Yeah, well,
statewide.
Taxes are not.
It may pass regionally. A good question from a couple of people is, how do we make transportation more socially just and address the equity issues?
Sure, I'll jump in on this. So there are a few different ways that transportation is not socially just, and Joshua spoke about the inequities in terms of car ownership. In addition, public transportation is often considered the source of travel for people who work traditional 9-to-5 jobs. And so peak hours on public transportation happen from 7:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. and then 4 to 7 p.m. And that's when regular service is reliable and can be taken without any problems usually. But when we talk about people with hourly jobs or lower wage jobs, they're not working 9 to 5. They're working shifts that often people who work hourly wage, low income jobs tend to leave for work between 5 and 6 a.m. And often public transportation is not available then, or it's not regular. It's every, say, 45 minutes during that stretch because it's considered before the morning rush hour. But in fact, there is a rush hour, it's just not counted. That is one way that it's not just. Another way is personal safety. Right now, women all over the country and the world, and people who are femme presenting are experiencing harassment in terms of sexual harassment, verbal harassment on public transportation, and in some countries it gets pretty violent. In some areas it can be pretty violent, and this isn't just about women, but it's much more widely reported by women, and still that's not even, there aren't even very high reporting rates. So in order to improve public transportation in terms of personal safety, we need to have actual police or safety officials in charge. And even people who are managing smaller buses or shared rides need to be equipped to deal with safety situations.
Also, the average car ownership on average costs between $8,000 to $14,000 a year. Think how that money could go toward housing if it were, reallocated.
And also, we heard a little bit earlier about the last mile. The last mile disproportionately affects low-income people. I'm a lucky person who can afford an apartment that is between 2 subway lines, one block away from me, 2 blocks away from me. If you live out at the end of the line and you only have 1 subway and it's 10 blocks away, you have a long subway ride and a long walk or a long weird bus ride to the subway station. And so thinking about how you can improve access to a transit system to the people who can't afford the prime locations near the best transit hubs.
Great. Someone reminded me that the Conference on World Affairs has done a nice job with the first and final mile by setting up remote parking at 29th Street, and you can park there and take the shuttles in. Just a little reminder. We have some questions, and you've touched on some of this, but should cities prioritize bus rapid transit over light rail or vice versa? And how do we change the public perception around buses?
I have one thing about changing the public perception around buses. I was just in London. I think we heard another positive London story before, and we just got the subway head from London and New York, so hopefully some of these things are coming our way. But the bus in London had this incredible, one of the things that makes me wary of getting on a bus sometimes is I don't know where it's going to go. It's one of the things that is appealing about, say, light rail or subways over buses is you know exactly where it's going to stop. Whereas you get on a bus and you're like, well, this could go anywhere. And in London, they have this amazing system where the stops are all marked out on a map on the bus, and there's a voice like we have in the subway now that says the next stop will be, and you can see exactly where you're going, and you can see 3 stops ahead where it's going to be. It makes a world of difference and a sense of control and of your transportation experience that I think would be a really big asset in the bus experience.
Waleed, any comment on that? That seems like pretty easy technology,
Well,
doesn't
I
it?
just want to add, too, that New Orleans, we have 5 streetcars now, and we're putting in more. And the reason we love them is that they are permanent and they're fixed. And anybody who develops or invests in the area is guaranteed that that is going to be there. And that's my only complaint about bus rapid transit, which we also have. And we're looking at our system right now is that it can move around, and it's very, very frustrating for people who move in an area and depend on it, and then that system ends up moving or changing.
Yeah, just to add one option, I think there are things we can do in terms of mobile. I mean, we have this platform with mobile devices to surface some of that information in a way that makes it very easily consumable. When I began at the beginning, I talked about data. But when I try to catch a bus, my biggest concern is it running late? Is it on time? Yeah. And this is where the data, either coming from the buses themselves, or increasingly from people who tell you that I'm on this bus, and then they can aggregate that data in a privacy-sensitive way and share it back to the user. We have that information now. So I'm hoping that the surfacing of the data coming from the cities and us and applications across the spectrum kind of making that information more accessible will help reduce that reluctance to use buses. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah.
Great. One interesting question is there any hope until cars get down to 1,000 pounds? Fly away.
Is there any hope until cars get down to 1,000 pounds?
Yeah. Not
I
a
don't know
question
how much
you
cars
really
weigh.
understand. All right, how about this
Not
one?
great on weight, of course.
Do you have ideas to optimize transportation in rural and small town areas with severe weather?
It's very specific.
Or just rural and small town areas? What are the different considerations where you get, even suburban areas, you get less dense? You know, what are your thoughts on those?
I think this is where some of the more flex options, again, you know, whether it's Uber or now many transit authorities have something equivalent, whether it's like a flexible option, gives a lot of flexibility in rural areas. Other modes don't work so well in rural, like obviously you can't have e-bikes are way less effective, scooters are not effective. So I think that's where, again, we can look at flexible options that are more software based and that can make a big difference for some people at least. And especially people with disabilities who are also adversely impacted, particularly by some of the constraints in public transport.
Yeah, and also there is, the shuttles are great, but I think defining what you are, whether you're rural, suburban, or you really are a walkable town. I have a historic property in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is a historic town surrounded by a military park. But it's sprawled out when they put in the interstate. And we do have a bus that circulates. It's a small shuttle that circulates in the historic area. And not only do we, you know, locals use it, but the tourists love it.
I think a lot of what we've talked about today is most significantly applicable to urban environments or metropolitan regions around dense urban centers. I think that's important because we live in an urbanizing world. The vast majority of people are living in urban or urban metropolitan regions right now. That said, I think there are the small town center of rural communities has largely, in many cases, been abandoned, and those are and were walkable communities. And I think, and so planning and investment in the historic core of smaller communities, I think, is one of the ways that some of these issues can apply to rural areas. You're up against what we've had at the same, you know, just in the recent period of time that cars have occupied the dominant transportation position that they have. American tastes in the way that they live have radically changed, and we all now, many of us now, aspire to a quality of life that is car dependent. And that is especially limiting in rural communities where there isn't enough density to have transit connecting all of these things. So I think, Americans are reevaluating how much they want to live in suburban semi-isolation versus in denser small town and urban environments, and I think that's one of the shifts that's going to have to happen.
I agree, and it needs to be said that the use of transportation and land use go hand in hand in this country. If the only affordable home you can find is in an outer ring suburb, then you are stuck being dependent on your car. So there are some innovations happening in this area, but I do think that there will be a condensation of patterns of land use where people will begin to live in more dense, walkable areas, which is starting to happen with the millennial generation, and it's looking like it's only increasing. Right now, about 60% of Americans live in cities, and it's not always the cities like New York, it's cities like South Bend, Indiana. But there are a lot of innovations to improve mobility in the suburbs. For example, Pittsburgh is looking at mobility hubs, where it's kind of an upgrade of your historic park and ride. So instead of parking and hopping on the bus to your job, there are a lot of resources at this spot, such as a daycare for children, buses that go straight to the school, dry cleaners, pharmacy, things that you would have to deal with, multiple stops on your way, but instead they're all in one stop, and everything you need fanning out from there is available. A bus to different parts of town, or to another neighboring town, and then your random errands that you need to take care of. That's the kind of thing we need to start working on. There are other cities, other suburban towns that are working on working with the private sectors to subsidize shared rides to the transit stop. These are mostly kind of commuter towns. One is in New Jersey that have developed partnerships with cities and ride shares to get people to the commuter train. That's really valuable, and it's even more telling that these cities found it to be more cost effective to subsidize ride share than to build additional parking.
Great. We got a question from a student here that relates to intercity transportation. What are your opinions on the prospects and utility of high-speed rail in the United States? And is the current Amtrak system at all a suitable competitor to interurban aviation?
I'll jump on this.
Jump on that.
Okay. If you've been on the Amtrak Northeast Corridor, it is certainly a competitor to aviation. It's more pleasant, more efficient, and it's overall a better experience. But in Amtrak, the Northeast Corridor, which stretches from Boston to Washington, D.C. But it is Amtrak's busiest corridor. In terms of high-speed rail, we are facing political issues, technological issues, and overall an unwillingness by the public to, and this may be rightfully so, to have high-speed rail running through their towns and not stopping. That's an issue in California right now. If you want high-speed rail, it can't make too many stops or else it never actually reaches high speed. And so then you have all these towns, say if you have high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles, will it stop in the 8 cities or so along the way, or will it pass right through them? And because high-speed rail technologically needs as straight a path as possible, we will need to establish a right-of-way for this mode, and it might be right through a town, and I think most towns would not be in favor of having this happen.
This is a project I've actually been working on with a friend, another architect actually from Boulder. We've been proposing that we take the existing rail infrastructure that's right now used primarily by freight trains and putting back in the passenger rail. We could, all of these little towns all over could be perfectly connected by this infrastructure that is not used anymore. And these towns are fabulous. They have, most of them were built by railroads. They have perfect grids in place. They have fabulous architecture, green spaces. They are wasted. They are the little gems in this country, and there are like 24,000 of them. And if they're connected with rail, all we need is passenger rail. I don't even think we really need high-speed rail except in really dense areas.
Even though it's not a set of specific proposed policies, I think that this is the kind of subject where we have to think about something like the Green New Deal. Because the solutions to the issues that we're talking about require massive public investment that you're only going to have with a major governmental initiative like that. And at the same time, you're never going to get there with leadership that wants to prioritize burning coal and making sure that cars don't get high gas mileage and all of those things. So this is if you want to see any of these things happen, it's ultimately a political question as well.
By the way, rail still exists in the South primarily and in the East. A lot of it was taken out in the West, and I'm not sure why, but it was. A lot of the existing rail, but the right-of-way is still there in a lot of the country.
Great. I think we have time for one more. How would you manage the conflict of pedestrians and electrical scooters using the same sidewalk? You can do like New York and Boulder and make it hard to do, right?
Right. So the question isn't as much what do you do with pedestrians versus electric scooters, it's what do you do with all these new modes.
Right.
Electric scooters may or may not be of interest in 2 years to people who are riding them now, and there may be something else new and exciting in 2 years. But the fact is that these modes that fall under the umbrella of micromobility, which are bikes, electric scooters, non-electric scooters, hoverboards, skateboards, and electric skateboards, all these modes are popular, and their popularity is only growing. So I know that there is a lot of, I know that electric scooters are a diabolical issue, but they are, as long as cities can actually mandate where these vehicles go and hold the users, the riders, accountable for how they're getting around and how they're behaving on their scooters, just like vehicle drivers are responsible for how they drive, then we can have a kind of peaceful coexistence.
I think it's also important to remember the greatest danger to the pedestrian is the car, it's not the scooter. Just as for all of the fuss about how many people were going to be hurt by cyclists, the greatest danger to the pedestrian is not the cyclist, it's the car. All of that said, I just nearly got hit at a high speed by a cyclist on a New York City street just the other day while I was crossing the light with the green. And I think we all, some work needs to be done on civility and rule following across all of these modes. I am in New York a person who is a pedestrian, is a cyclist, and is a driver. I have a car, which is insane. I shouldn't, but I do. And so as somebody who is all three of these things, the pedestrians hate the cyclists because they come zooming along and scare them and break laws and can be scary. The cyclists hate the pedestrians because they're wearing earphones and looking at their phones and stepping out into the bike lane and I've nearly hit oblivious pedestrians when I had the bike right of way. You understand their issue. And then as a car, you hate them both. You hate both the pedestrians and the cyclists are all doing crazy things in New York City. The pedestrians are walking out in the middle of 34th Street against the light, and you know they should have the right to do that, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous behavior, and the cyclists are doing crazy things. So all of the users of these modes are all behaving somewhat badly, and as more and more modes come into the mix, we're going to have to work that much harder to figure out how everybody can coexist harmoniously. But I think we do always have to remember at base, the greatest danger and the greatest threat is still coming from private cars and trucks.
Again, this is panel 2602. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming, and let's tell our panelists thanks. It was great.
I didn't mean to be so hard on you. I'm sorry. I'm mad. I do like Uber, and I didn't mean. I feel like I was coming off so.
No.